You took over in August and promptly instituted the protest policy of presumptively declining to prosecute certain charges. How has that policy worked since then in the last couple of months? Has it done what you envisioned it doing?
Yeah, and thank you for getting it right in terms of we presumptively decline. And what that means is that we still screen and look at every single case. And we're looking to see, is there any evidence of property damage or intent to commit damage? So if you had a backpack, and it was full of weapons, things like that, we're still taking those cases. But the cases we're not taking, presumptively declining to take, are the cases where there's no evidence of intent or actual harm or damage. So the protest policy is working as we planned. Up to date, and we have a dashboard on our website that shows how many charges have been referred to our office. We've had over 1,000 arrests referred. We've screened, so that means we've screened over 1,000 cases. We have right now issued and charged around 130 or so cases, mainly felonies. And we still have at least another 150 or more that are pending review and follow-up. So, using the limited resources of our office to focus on the cases that actually present danger and harm to the community is what we've been doing. Had we just been issuing every single one of those cases, we really wouldn't have the resources to follow through on those prosecutions.
And as you mentioned, you're still screening every case. Following along in e-courts, it seems like some of them are no complainted very quickly, sometimes as soon as the next day. Is that enough time to actually look at the facts of each case?
So in e-court where it says no complaint, sometimes that means that we are still screening the cases. Sometimes for certain types of charges, we need more evidence. For example, an assault charge. One of the things we need to issue an assault charge would be evidence from the victim of how much the damage was, how injured did they get. And it's not always apparent the very next day to the victim. They could, if you have a hospital situation, broken bones, things like that, sometimes we need more information. So just looking at no complaint doesn't always give you whether or not we're actually going to continue to follow up on those cases. So I'd be careful looking at that.
Okay. So, looking at the cases that have been referred to your office, it's somewhere in the realm of 80 to 90% that have been no complainted. What's the likelihood of something like that being reinstated within I think it's a 2-year statute of limitations to then bring charges? Is that likely to happen?
The vast majority, no, it's not likely to happen. The vast majority of those are going to fall within our policy parameters of no evidence of harm or damage. We're not talking about somebody who's lit fires or broken out glass. We're talking about people who were probably, the normal scenario we see is people were ordered to leave and they either didn't leave or they didn't leave fast enough and they end up getting arrested. So that's the type of case that we're predominantly talking about. And so for the vast majority of those, they won't end up being issued.
We're approaching 5 months now of continued almost nightly unrest. Some of that was before you took office. A few months have been after. Many people living downtown and primarily business owners downtown are really frustrated right now. What role, if any, does your office play in making it so they don't feel like they need to board up their windows or worry about confrontations with protesters?
Yeah, well, like you say, I took over on August 1st. I think that was day around night 70 or so of the protests. And I had to make a decision based on resources in this office where we were going to prioritize. And where we are prioritizing is exactly where the harm is being done. So what we have done since being district attorney, I've reached out to colleagues. The Attorney General has helped us and given us additional resources so that we're focusing our cases, making cases against people doing the harm, breaking windows of businesses, lighting things on fire, stealing from those stores in the protest environment. So that's what we're focusing on. We're not using our limited resources on the people who aren't doing those things. So in terms of for businesses, we've gone out and we collaborate with our other agencies and we focus on those cases that are doing the damage.
Your office has gotten a ton of criticism in the past few months. Do you feel any responsibility for the continued unrest, or is there some balance between law and order and protecting people's right to free speech?
I think there always has to be balance, right? If we just prosecuted every single one of those cases, there is zero doubt in my mind that there were people that are out there, many people. In fact, I would say the majority of people for the right reasons, protesting, wanting to call attention to the fact that our criminal justice system is not working the way that our community would like it to, that we see rampant disparity, over incarceration of people being held with bail amounts that they can't get out pre-trial. So there's been a lot of issues and policing issues that are being brought to the forefront. So the vast majority of people, if we were just prosecuting every one of those arrests, we would be effectively chilling speech. And that's the line that we have to draw, and that's the line that we attempted to draw. And absolutely, we've gotten some criticism from the policy, but I'll say that I've been reached out to many people, including business owners, saying and extolling the value of this policy. Many business owners are, in fact, also taxpayers, and they know that we have a limited amount of resources. When I talk to them, they appreciate that we're prioritizing on the people actually creating the harm, not the people who are not doing that, and then leading us to a protracted litigation where we're going to end up going to trial in the middle of a COVID pandemic with a huge backlog already mounting, that we're going to take resources away from other pressing issues in our community, the uptick in gun violence, the uptick in homicides that we're facing, and the people actually doing damage at the protests. So when I talk to people in the business community, I think they understand as a business person themselves, you got to prioritize resources and focus where you're going to get the most return on your investment. That's what we're doing.
And you alluded to this a little bit with the working with different departments. One of the last times we spoke with the mayor, he said he's been doing everything in his power to contain the violence and arrest people who are committing crimes, but that he has to rely on the courts to, quote, pass judgments that hold people accountable. What is your working relationship like with the city and with police? Are you able to hold people accountable?
Yeah, it started off a little bit rocky, with my first day on the job and then jumping right into, the situation that I was in. But since then, we have been focusing our resources and efforts together. Portland Police has dedicated more detectives to investigating cases where people are actually doing harm and damage. That has enabled us to prosecute those cases. What we were seeing earlier on in the protests was we didn't have the evidence and the follow-up we needed and the resources dedicated to actually making those cases. So on a nightly basis, when people would say, hey, things were lit on fire last night, why aren't you prosecuting arsonists? Well, if you looked at the cases that were actually referred to my office, you wouldn't see the arsons, right? You would only see interference with a peace officer. So PPB has been dedicating more resources to putting their detectives at a time when they're already stretched thin. So we're pulling in the same direction, and we've been working with the mayor's office as well. I think a little bit of a start and how I was going to prioritize things was off a little bit rocky, but essentially we are all now focused on making those cases. And I think truly, I believe that's one of the reasons why the protests have started to wind down, is the people that are doing damage are no longer able to continue to do that.
One of the other complaints about the policy is that some people say it's fundamentally discriminatory and that it protects one group of defendants from prosecution, but other people are still being charged with the same crimes, like riot. Of course, I'm sure you're aware of Joey Gibson appealing on such grounds. Is this a discriminatory policy?
Well, so as you know, the Joey Gibson matter, we have pending litigation going on. So I'm not going to comment on that case specifically. But in general, I took over in this office on August 1st. I made this policy go back only to the very beginning of this protest. And if you read the document, it talks about one of the reasons for that is because these protests, pursuant to what happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis, are about directing criticism towards the criminal justice system. So going back, further, the same circumstances don't apply. So we are treating everyone absolutely equal from the start date of this policy, which is May 29th, and going forward. So it's not focused on one group or the other. We have prosecuted people and are not, there have been demonstrations for people who would consider to be on the right side of the spectrum. And the same criteria applies to them in this matter as it does to anybody that you would consider to be politically on the left side of the spectrum. So going forward from once I've been DA, we're treating everybody absolutely the same. And then cases that came with my predecessor and before me, it's not the same circumstances, not the same moment that we're in, and we're not talking about the criminal justice system as the object of protest.
Does that mean that if there were protests to pop up regarding another topic, they might not be covered under the same policy?
Yeah, we're going to reevaluate. We're going to reevaluate. This is not my policy forever and going forward. This was recognizing that in a moment where people are criticizing how we do business and what they expect to see, we have the ability to chill speech if we are too aggressive in using our authority towards people who are not causing harm. And so that's why it's so important in this specific moment to tailor it. Now, if a year from now and we're in another summer and protests are coming up about something else, I'll reevaluate the policy. But I'll tell you what, another thing that has shown up in this is that some of our charges that we use have some issues with them, to be quite frank. So looking at interference with a peace officer, Molly Harbinger at the Oregonian wrote a great article about some of the constitutional flaws with that legal statute. I expect that the legislature will take a look at some of those crimes and see if they want to change them in this upcoming legislative session. If they do that, then I think that could also change whether or not I felt the need to have such a policy in the future.
You hold office in a county that is expected to overwhelmingly vote against President Trump next week. The nightly unrest, though, and violence in Portland has given the president unending content for his political campaign. Are you concerned your decision to not prosecute cases will backfire on the national stage?
Well, so I mean, at this point, where the nightly protests, we've seen that really kind of wind down, and it certainly was a part of his campaign rhetoric, but we haven't seen it in recent days. You know, I actually look at it in the other way. If I had decided that I was going to have a very heavy hand and prosecute every one of those cases, I think we could still be seeing protests on a nightly basis right now. And in fact, I think the evidence for that is borne out by how President Trump did react to Portland when he sent in federal troops and they tried to have this overwhelming force response of putting it down, using force in prosecutions. If that was the same approach that I took, I think we'd still be seeing the nightly unrest because people would see it's fundamentally unfair when people are criticizing the system. So drawing the line where we drew it and focusing on people who are actually committing harm is something that I think everybody in this community understands and can get behind. And then we're not risking the fact that some people are out there legitimately to voice their concerns, but could inadvertently end up in the criminal justice system. We don't want that. Nobody wants that. So I actually think the way that we've kind of walked this line, and it's a line, it's tough, but the way that we do it, I actually believe has led ultimately to the cooling off and a de-escalation of the nightly protests, and rather than an escalation.